Thank you, Mischief makers. We're back with another recap of our favorite Time is Not Linear show, Loki. I'm your host, Anthony, and I'll do my best to be your guide in this marvelous show as we're picking up right where episode 1 ended with our dynamic duo of Mobius and Loki searching throughout the multiverse for the variant we lovingly know as Sylvie. But first, do me a favor. If you're new here, please consider giving this channel a like and subscribe to keep up with our weekly Loki analyses and breakdowns. I'm truly deeply grateful for you allowing me to have your time, as I understand how valuable that is. I would truly be grateful if you could do the unthinkable and hit that like button. Please hit that like button. YouTube uses this to help smaller channels like me to grow even in 2023. Like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. This way you can watch us every week as we break down these episodes every Thursday and try to figure out the mystery of Loki Season 2. I really appreciate it. Thank you. This episode opens up with our favorite duo making a stop in London in the year 1977, where they seem to be stopping by a movie premiere for a hot new Brad Wolf movie named Zaniac. We even see the art for the movie, with Zaniac looking like a mix of the Hulk and Werewolf by Night. We then catch up with the star of the movie, Brad, who looks like a cool enough guy, and he seems to be having the time of his life, enjoying his premiere, walking around, taking pictures with fans, and answering questions for reporters. Mobius approaches the man of the hour, whom, surprisingly, actually recognizes Mobius and greets him with a hug. Loki enters the chat, and Brad decides that things are going the wrong direction and decides to make a run for it into an alley. Loki and Mobius give chase, but Loki, being an actual god of mischief and a wizard, takes this opportunity to use that magic of his that we haven't seen him use in a while. Brad realizes that things went from bad to worse and books it as fast as left foot and right foot will take him until he's cornered by Loki. He then pulls off a trick of his own and teleports himself the heck out of there. It seems to have finally lost Loki and Mobius as he reappears and makes his getaway in another alley. Brad seems to be getting away when the oddest thing happens when Brad finds himself surrounded by a crowd of upper middle class people who start acting like they're from the South Bronx and start pressing Brad to run his watch. Like, it's really weird to see a bunch of guys in suits and ties getting ready to jump this dude and rob him of his dignity. Brad tries to listen to what Pop Smoke said and fight back, but I gotta admit that I don't like his odds at all. Brad takes a swing at one of the West Side Story extras with a metal pipe he found on the ground, but the pipe goes right through the dude and doesn't make any impact, and we now realize that this is our guy Loki once again using that magic of his that we don't see him use often enough and casting an illusion. Brad tries to teleport again, but Loki disarms him. Brad then takes off running, but yo, for real, we see the Loki that we all know and love, and even hear the music get real dark as Loki then uses his actual shadows to reveal his Loki devil horns and hem Brad up against a brick wall while Loki stands by and watches with his trademark devilish grin. Mobius catches up with them, and even Mobius is at least a little concerned by Loki's actions and comments about whether or not all this was necessary. Either way, it's a wrap for Brad's acting career. We then switch back to the TVA and Brad, aka X5, seemingly under arrest and wearing that TVA prisoner jumpsuit that we saw Loki wearing back in Season 1, as well as what looks like an inhibitor collar around his neck. Why does Brad Wolf need an inhibitor collar? I have no idea, but someone at Marvel said, let's do it, so he's wearing it. Hunter B-15 asks him about his modifications to his temp pad that he was using to teleport, but he decides to get cheeky and not give straight answers. We then switch back to the basement with Loki and Mobius revisiting OB in the basement, who's still trying to figure out a solution to the TVA's dire situation of, the destruction of the multiverse because of the overloaded Lul. For some reason, Mobius and Loki ask him to stop what he's doing and take a look at Brad's temp pad, and OB tells him that, yeah, he can take a look at it, but for real, is this a higher priority than preventing a temporal meltdown? Loki and Mobius rightfully feel stupid for interrupting my guy, and OB gives them some homework and tells them to read the damn handbook he wrote since he already put all the answers in the book. We then switch to Hunter B-15 speaking to Casey, trying to see if Casey has had any luck finding Ravonna Renslayer. Sadly, Casey has had no luck with finding Ravonna, especially since they have all these additional branch timelines to search through for her location. And they're short one supercomputer to help them now that they don't have access to Miss Minutes. We then switch back to Loki and Mobius, who are looking like two frat boys about to take a test that they forgot to study for and are trying to cram it all in at the last minute. They're trying to figure out Brad's... Listen, I know his name is X5, but I like the name Brad, so let's just go with it for a while. They're trying to figure out what the hell Brad did to his temp pad while using Obi's handbook to help, and this just looks pathetic. Like, they are terrible at this. Thankfully, Casey and B-15 come and interrupt the struggle to share the valuable information that Miss Minutes is actually helping Ravonna Renslayer, and that's why Miss Minutes is AWOL and not responding to their attempts to reach her. Loki lets them know about the conversation that he heard on that recording in the war room last episode, where He Who Remains explained that Renslayer is in cahoots with He Who Remains. Casey asks Loki and Mobius what it is they think they're doing with that temp pad they've been fumbling with, and Casey decides to spare them any further embarrassment and explains that he can analyze the temp pad for them since, he actually did his homework and studied the TVA handbook. Loki tries to save face and suggests that he and Mobius instead invest their time and energy and see if they can get any information out of Brad. We then switch to the holding room with Brad, with Mobius, Loki, and Hunter B-15 preparing to interrogate Brad, but they're at a disadvantage since Brad knows all of their tricks and techniques. And I have to admit that the scene that happens next is downright hilarious. Brad, who's looking like a young Ewan McGregor, delivers one of the sassiest performances in the history of Loki. Mobius and B-15 try to get Brad to answer some simple questions, and he gives them the sassiest sass this side of the multiverse. Brad gives them the business and calls out all of the hypocrisy in the room by pointing out how Brad was just minding his business and living his best life. Isn't Hunter B-15 the one who was going on and on about how they all had lives on the sacred timeline? And Loki tries to jump in and say something slick about how there are lives at stake, and Brad is not about to take no ish from Loki about putting lives at risk. Like, this Loki has some nerve talking about there are lives at stake, especially this Loki, since he's the one that got plucked out of the multiverse right after he launched the Chitauri attack on Earth and had to be stopped by the Avengers. Brad gives Loki the business and has Loki looking stupid, but then Brad makes the criminal error and finds himself in his own episode of
When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong.
Brad commits the lunchroom sin of talking about Loki's mother. And I gotta admit that Loki is doing his absolute best to keep his cool and not rip this dude's head off. Like, Loki is scary pissed off and starts talking to Brad in that creepy, calm, soft voice that villains use right before they rip someone's head off. Mobius and B-15 notice it and are a little concerned, but Brad is not impressed and continues giving him some sass and even doubles down by referring to Loki as Mobius's pet. Mobius tries to defuse the situation by offering Brad a chance to return to his life as an actor. But Brad uses this moment to remind Mobius that he was kidnapped from the timeline, and everyone left their lives behind. And he starts doing the most until Mobius snaps and slaps the taste out of Brad's mouth like it was the Academy Awards all over again. Loki and B-15 pull Mobius out of the room, and Brad laughs it off after acknowledging his victory in this fight. We then switch to Loki and Mobius going for a walk after Brad gave them the business. Like, it's sad. They lost bad. Mobius is very, very irritable right now, and Loki suggests that they get some pie, with Mobius picking his favorite, key lime. After a bite or two of pie, Mobius admits that he lost his cool. Loki tries to relate with him about how we all lose our cool sometimes, and recalls that time that he took New York hostage with the Chitauri army because, he lost his cool. Good times. Loki then asks Mobius about some of the things Brad brought up and asks Mobius if he has any interest in visiting the life he lost before he was kidnapped and brought to the TVA. And Mobius says he's not interested. It's not his life anymore. He likes the life that he has with the TVA and he's not interested in looking back. Why? Because what if it's something good? What if he lost a really good life? Like, what would that do to him? He'd rather forget than look back. Loki and Mobius then switch the subject and start strategizing about how they're going to get information that they need out of X5, aka Brad. They theorize that X5 might have found Sylvie and chose not to bring her in so that he could instead live the life of a movie star. They realize that if he did find her, then they still have a chance. We then switch back to OB in that room that looks like the bridge of a Starship Voyager holding a device in his hands. We then get another good shot of all the timelines overloading the temporal loom, and I gotta admit that this mess does not look good at all. OB tries to get ready to use the device he made, but unfortunately, he's denied access to the computer, which gives him the error message that he has an invalid temporal aura. We then switch back to Brad in his cell, and Loki walks in. Brad asks him straight up if he's ready for round 2, and Brad is ready. Like, he's confident because that last round didn't go Loki's way at all. Mobius then wheels in some weird-looking smut toy with a vacuum hose, and Loki helps him set it up. And Brad is calling cap on the whole thing, like thinking that there's no way that they're about to torture him for information. It's at that moment that Loki reveals he was playing possum, and he locks Mobius out of the room and lets Brad know that he is not with the shits anymore. He lets Brad know that he better start talking because Loki is embracing his villainous side and he's about to go in on Brad's soft. Brad is noticeably shooketh of this weird looking device, especially when Loki turns it on. Mobius is still locked out, and it's at this moment that Brad notices that he's now in his own private episode of
When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong.
I mean, Brad is really shooketh. It even apologizes for bringing up Loki's mama earlier. Loki is not trying to hear it, and it's at this moment we find out what this device does when a force field appears and crushes Brad's stool. Loki then presses another button and a force field appears around Brad, with Loki gradually shrinking the field around Brad's body, with Brad realizing he's like 2 minutes from losing it all. Loki then starts throwing all of Brad's words back at him and starts enjoying himself as he scares the lunch out of Brad. Now, real quick, something really interesting about this scene and episode is the fact that Brad constantly tells Loki and Mobius that none of this is real, which is an odd thing for him to say, all things considered. He's not saying that none of this matters or none of this is important. He keeps saying none of this is real. It feels like Brad knows something more about the larger story that he's absolutely not sharing. But it did stand out to me hearing Brad say this, even though he's on the verge of being crushed into a can of tuna. I mean, that is weird, right? None of this is real? Anyway, Brad's room is getting smaller and smaller when he finally gives up and agrees to talk and tells them that Sylvie has a new life. He tells Loki that he found Sylvie on a branch before he abandoned his post, and Loki and Mobius demand that he show them where. We then switch back to the Starship Bridge with B-15 bringing Casey down to help OB, and OB hilariously running up the stairs exclaiming that it's a wrap for the TVA and he is not going to be able to get the blast doors open to use his new device. Casey and OB then have a bromance moment when Casey realizes that this is the OB guy who actually wrote the TVA guidebook. OB then tells him that the blast doors are locked and can only be opened by He Who Remains, who's not around anymore, or by Miss Minutes, who's gone AWOL and is working with the enemy. Let that sink in. Either way, they're screwed. We then switch back to McDonald's? I'm sorry, y'all. The kid in me is a sucker for the sight of those golden arches, and I especially melt when I see one in the aesthetics and designs of my childhood, with the brown bricks and each restaurant looking like a house of fun and entertainment. Loki, Mobius, and Brad arrive, with Brad letting them know Sylvie is inside, so they can head in and talk to her while the getting is good, because he's not trying to stick around for this. Mobius is a little suspicious as to why Brad is trying to leave so bad, and then Brad brings up a valid point that he's not trying to get caught up with a Loki variant that killed 400 of their co-workers, and yo, I can't even front, that line had me laughing on the inside. Did I mention that I like Brad? Like, I really like Brad. I feel connected with this guy as he says the stuff that I be thinking. Loki kind of tunes this all out and seems ready to get this thing started when we see the inside of the 80s goodness that is a McDonald's, with Sylvie seemingly having a job there and working the register. She sees Loki and gets all pensive, and Loki decides to walk up to the girl he loved who betrayed him so he can get some answers. Sylvie agrees to talk to him outside, and she heads out during her break to get this over with as she slurps down a milkshake and eats her lunch. Loki and Sylvie go back and forth for a bit, with Loki explaining that he needs her help and tells Sylvie that he was able to time travel into the future, and he saw Sylvie there inside the TVA. Sylvie has no idea what he's talking about and seems genuinely disinterested in any of this nonsense that Loki is talking about. Loki pleads with her that they need to help the TVA in order to save the multiverse. We then switch to Mobius and Brad inside the McDonald's for some additional product placement, where we see Mobius scarfing down an extra value meal. Mobius and Brad talk for a bit, all the crazy stuff that's been happening, and Brad is not trying to sit down and have a casual conversation with the guy who just tortured him. Mobius, tries to lighten the mood and asks Brad to talk about his movie, Zaniac, with Brad not trying to have a conversation with this dude because it's cinema. It's an elevated thriller. Mobius wouldn't understand. And somewhere in the multiverse, I hope Martin Scorsese is chuckling. We then switch back to Loki and Sylvie outside, with Sylvie done talking and ready to get back to her shift. Brad is once again shooketh and is doing his absolute best to convince Loki and Mobius to return to the TVA, even going as far as to say that it's a wrap for all their lives if they stay here. Me, Mobius, and Loki are all sincerely confused on what the heck this man is talking about, with Sylvie having heard enough and decides to enchant Brad and reads his mind, where he sees that General Dox is preparing to bomb all the new divergent branches from the sacred timeline. I was wondering where she was going with all that hardware at the end of last episode, and now we know. Mobius and Loki alert Hunter B-15 on what's going on, and then decide to give chase to General Dox. We then switch to some warehouse where we see Dox and a bunch of TVA agents using this place as a base of operations, and we also learn that they've already destroyed 30% of the divergent timelines. Loki, Sylvie, and Mobius decide to jump in and use their powers to try to get in front of the situation, but they're not moving fast enough. Loki and Sylvie are able to combine their powers and finally stop General Dox, but a good majority of the timelines are already gone. Loki, Mobius, and Sylvie return to the TVA, where we get a new look of what's left of the timelines, and wow. What once looked like a tree is now looking like a twig, and there are barely any branches left shooting out of the sacred timeline, much to the horror and shock of Hunter B-15. Suddenly, Casey gets a hit on Ravonna Renslayer's temp pad. Sylvie is disgusted by the utter failure of the TVA and decides to go back to work. Loki, Mobius, and the rest of the TVA are left behind to wallow in their failure. We then switch back to McDonald's, with Sylvie sitting outside and just hanging out on her Ford pickup staring at the sky. One of her co-workers checks in on her to make sure she's okay, and she says she is, and that she'll be back tomorrow for her shift. And then, end credits. And I have to admit that this episode had me laughing a lot more than I expected. Did I mention that I like Brad? Brad and his elitist views on cinema is doing the absolute most, and he's doing his absolute best to be my new favorite character on this show. Obi is still far ahead in first place right now as my new favorite MCU character for the moment, but my guy Brad is making it a competition, for real. Oh, and it's cool to see Sylvie again, but I gotta admit that I struggle with finding reasons to like this character. I get her character and what she's supposed to represent, but I'm not a fan of what she represents, and her character often comes off as a spoiled child who's mad at the way her parents are raising her, without ever lifting a finger to either help or understand the situation. She just has teenage temper tantrums, says some slick-ish, and storms off without offering any real valid solutions to help address the things that she has a problem with. I think the role is being well acted. I just don't like the temperament of the character at all. Something about overly entitled acting characters just rubs me the wrong way. But this was a cool episode. It had its moments. It didn't have any Jonathan Majors or Ravonna Renslayer, but it had its moments. Oh, and the music. Listen, I like the Wonder Years type closing credits at the end of each episode, and the soundtrack of this season is downright one of the best in Marvel in recent memory. Guardians of the Galaxy better take notes, because that song, Cosmic Blues by Janis Joplin at the end is fuego. Overall, this episode was decent. It didn't neatly connect with the last episode, and it didn't move the narrative much further ahead than it was in the episode 1. But hey, we gotta see a McDonald's. What did you all think of this episode? Am I being too harsh? Or do you guys agree and Marvel needs to pick up the pace in this limited 6-episode season? Anyway, that's all I have for this one. Hey, as usual, if you guys are new here to the movie blog, please do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe. This way you can join us every Thursday as we do our deep dives and try to figure out the mystery of Loki Season 2. Otherwise, I'm going to have to check you all later. Peace.